Two St. Lawrence County brothers are accused of violently engaging in the January 6, 2021 breach of the U.S. Capitol. A federal complaint says 47-year-old Reynold Voisin of Nicholville and 48-year-old Roger Voisin Jr. of Canton are each charged with several felonies. Court documents allege both men wore paintball masks to conceal their identities and played active roles in the day's violence. Among specifics, one is accused of throwing a pipe at an officer, using a stolen police shield to ram into the police line, and swinging a table leg with protruding nails at officers. They face felony counts of civil disorder, assaulting, resisting, or impeding certain officers with a deadly or dangerous weapon, disorderly and disruptive conduct in a restricted building or grounds with a deadly or dangerous weapon, and violence in a restricted building or grounds with a dangerous weapon. The brothers were arrested last Thursday in Plattsburgh. When they turned themselves in, they were arraigned and released. They're due back in court on November 7th.